So, Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. If you've been following this series up till now, you've probably noticed that it's had a bit of a negative slant so far. Generation 1 I did think was outright a bit bad. Generation 2 I thought was fine, but there was a lot about it that really annoyed me, and it was getting to the point that a lot of people in the comment sections of those videos were kind of doubting that I even liked this series at all. Ruby and Sapphire, I am happy to say, is where that's gonna start to change. I have my doubts they're gonna come all that close to topping my ranking by the end of this series, but these are the first Pokemon games where I think I can say, confidently enough, that I like them. I think they're good. I do still think they have a few pretty glaring issues, and while, as of recording, I haven't replayed the game I have in mind yet, from memory I do think they are massively overshadowed by another version of this adventure that is simply better in just about every way, but in a vacuum, I don't really think there's that much wrong with Ruby and Sapphire. Par for the course with the older games, the tutorial section is, thankfully, very brief. Once again, little extensions are added here and there. Like, I think this is the first time the game actually forces you to watch the catching tutorial, but it's still less than 10 minutes before the game decides you're good to go. Hoenn probably has the best starter trio in the series. I think they're my personal favorites design-wise, but even aside from that, having used all three of them in numerous playthroughs, I think this is the trio with the most consistent performance. There is definitely an obvious strongest choice, but for most of the game, none of them are going to give you an especially hard time compared to the others. This time round, I elected to pick Trico. If you like this Pokemon, Gen 3 is probably the time to have it on your team. There was a pretty big change to the battle system in the generation after this one that most Pokemon benefited from, but this evolutionary family was one of the few that debatably got a bit screwed by it. And I should say that, in addition to the usual personal rules I play by, i.e. set mode, no bag items in battle, try not to overlevel too much, have most, if not all, of the Pokemon on my team be newly introduced in that region's generation, and no legendaries, I am also going to start paying a little bit of attention to my Pokemon stats. In addition to their base stats, as well as any EVs, modern equivalent of stat experience, that you give your Pokemon, every Pokemon is also assigned an IV, a random number ranging from 0 to 31 for each of their 6 stats, as well as a nature, which either does nothing, or gives them a 10% boost in one stat in exchange for a 10% reduction to another. These don't really matter much in a casual playthrough, but the series is going to start having some late-game challenges that, should one want to partake, which I do, they need to look for Pokemon where these are decent, at the very least. Speaking of looking for Pokemon, in a move that seems to be in direct opposition to Gen 2, which were sequels to Red and Blue first and foremost, rather than standing as their own distinct experiences, the Hoenn games, by comparison, contain almost no pandering to Gen 1ers, and one way this quickly becomes obvious is in the roster of Pokemon available to the player. The Hoenn Pokédex is very unique, in the sense that, throughout the series, this is the only time that a regional Pokédex has contained Pokemon from previous generations, but they were the minority. There were a couple of games with entirely new rosters, but far more common is the newly introduced Pokemon making up a minority of the Pokédex. Not only that, with a few exceptions like Pikachu, Magikarp, Staryu, and a couple of others, the returning Pokemon that were here tended not to be the super popular or iconic ones. Historically, it seems to have been pretty divisive whenever the games did this. It might be partially why Ruby and Sapphire and Black and White are the two worst-selling pairs of original versions in the whole series, but personally, I am fully on board with this decision. Not only do I tend to prefer mixing it up each time I play a Pokemon game, instead of relying on a similar squad every playthrough. You know, I like Snorlax, and Lapras, and the Evolutions, and the Pseudo-Legendaries, and the numerous other standard main team members, but I don't feel like I have to have them in every single adventure. But the different Pokemon available is, to me at least, a big part of what gives each region its own distinct flavor. And this is something I hope to get a bit more into if I eventually get to the 3D era generations, but the decline of the regional Pokédex in most of the more recent entries has been fairly disappointing to me. I guess it also helps that I happen to really like the new cast of Pokemon introduced in Generation 3. I don't think there's even a shadow of a doubt that, out of all the regions, Hoenn easily has the best roster of Pokemon available to the player right at the start of the game. You could practically fill out your entire team before the first gym and basically be set for the whole playthrough, but I wouldn't exactly recommend doing that because in every new area you unlock throughout almost the whole adventure, your selection remains just as great. Almost, to be clear. At one point, there is a pretty serious bottleneck in terms of which Pokemon are viable, but I think that'll be a bit more relevant in a different chapter. It has its flaws, such as the aforementioned bottleneck, and I do think Water-type Pokemon are massively overrepresented. In general, but in this region especially. But overall, I think this generation has one of my favorite Pokédex expansions in the entire series. Battling is a much better experience in Gen 3 than it was in any of the previous games. For one, the battle system runs so much faster now. You may remember in my Crystal review, I said something along the lines of, even though it looked better for the video to have move animations on, I basically had to turn them off for everything except important boss fights because they effectively doubled the length of every battle. Some of the move animations in that game had to border on 10 seconds long. I remember Surf being especially egregious, and that may not sound like a lot, but when you're using a move potentially hundreds of times throughout a playthrough, it adds up. In Ruby and Sapphire, I was fine to leave them on for basically the entire game. I rarely even thought about it. The new animations convey all of the necessary information in about 2 seconds. In fact, for perspective's sake, let's compare the battle animations for Surf in each generation. Oh, I forgot to turn off the animations again. The faster HP scroll really helps too. Gen 3 didn't just streamline the existing battle system though, it also made 2 major additions, both of which I think were upgrades. The first of these was abilities. An ability can be activated whenever a Pokemon is switched in, or sometimes only in more specific scenarios, and the effect varies widely. Sometimes it's like a move the Pokemon uses without having to take up a turn, like Intimidate lowering the opponent's attack stat. Sometimes it gives them the effect of an item without it taking up their hold item slot, like Overgrow giving Sceptile a boost in certain attacks when its health gets low, when normally you'd need a certain berry for that kind of boost. Sometimes it gives additional resistances or immunities, like Walreign's Thick Fat allowing them to have its ice as a secondary type, without losing the resistance to fire that water types normally have, as well as giving them the only triple resistance in the whole game. It was a good way to add more distinction between what each species of Pokemon was capable of, compared to others of its type. It definitely benefited some Pokemon a lot more than others, but I think it was a positive change overall. Now you can no longer sweep through the team of every Poison-type specialist by simply spamming Earthquake, because some of them might be immune to the move. The other major addition is double battles. Having 2 Pokemon on the field at once changes a lot more than you might think. It makes it a lot harder to get a clean sweep, because even if one of your Pokemon counters the opponent's entire team, that one Pokemon of yours usually can't target both opponents at once. And it's also a lot harder to play around the AI, since unless one of the opponents rolls a KO on one of your Pokemon, there's no reliable way of predicting who they're targeting and what move they're using. Double battles are also much faster paced. Single battles are guaranteed to at least last the same number of turns as the amount of Pokemon that the losing side has on their team. In double battles, that number halves. The only problem is that we don't actually get to see much of this complexity that double battles can add, because they are severely underutilized. The Pokemon series has a long history of introducing interesting new battle mechanics that could add some good variety to the gameplay, only to barely utilize them during the main adventure. Which is, of course, the extent of what the bulk of the people who play the game will experience, and that started right here with double battles. There are almost no trainers in the game that will have double battles with you, and I don't know if this is a bug or something, but the few that will won't even approach you in the overworld. You have to go out of your way to talk to them yourself. You could honestly get to the 7th gym, the only mandatory double battle in the entire game, before you even realize they're a thing. And that one battle is so easy that it's actually kind of pathetic. Also, before we move on, there is one other more minor change to the battle system that I actually think was a downgrade from the previous games. NPCs with healing items existed in Gen 2, but they were rare. They usually only had one or two of them, and they would generally only use them on their ace. They are everywhere in Gen 3. Not just bosses, even random filler trainers you encounter, right from the start of the game. I imagine this is probably less bothersome to people who don't play by the personal rules I do and allow themselves to use bag items in battle, but having the option to just turn these off would be nice. A setting you can change in the options menu, like battle mode. Plus, I would obviously prefer this not be a thing at all, but if NPCs are going to have healing items, their AI should be hard locked out of using them when the Pokemon you have out is faster than theirs and does more than half their health with a single attack, among other similar scenarios, because at that point they're not even helping themselves win, they're just drawing out the battle for no reason. Go away, Moth. Fucking Steven, just fuck off already. Like, fuck off. Fuck you. Just end. So, the first gym leader specializes in rock types. Again, this was basically a weird tradition they had with the older Pokemon games. I imagine the only reason they didn't do it in the Johto games was because the Kanto gym leaders were in those games as well. Though, as I alluded to in my Pokemon Yellow video, unlike Brock, here you aren't screwed depending on what starter you wind up with. Not only did they give Combuskin a secondary type which allowed them to deal with rock types themselves, so long as you don't mind overleveling a little bit to evolve them, there are also a variety of wild water and grass types available to the player, as well as several others that can at least hit rock types for neutral damage. I said it already, but the early selection the player gets in Hoenn really is great. That being said, having the type advantage isn't everything in this region. Ruby and Sapphire easily has the toughest roster of gym leaders out of the games I've covered so far. Now, some of them are only tougher in the sense that you are less likely to get a clean 6-0 sweep, or however many Pokemon they have, when compared to the previous generations. And that can usually be gotten around by simply throwing more bodies at the fight. Like, my first Pokemon couldn't quite get the sweep, but then my second Pokemon could finish them off. Definitely something to be concerned over if you're doing a Nuzlocke or some other challenge run where a Pokemon fainting in battle is actually a big deal, but in a casual playthrough, nothing to worry about. Many of them, however, do pose legitimate threats, and could sweep through your team if you don't play the battle right. Brawly and Winona have Pokemon with setup moves, so things can easily spiral out of control if you don't take them out quickly. Flannery's Pokemon all know Overheat, which is a really hard-hitting move, especially for that early in the game, that sometimes even resisting isn't quite enough to withstand. Plus, her earlier Pokemon will often set up Sunny Day for her ace, having the damage of Water-type moves and making Overheat hit even harder. Norman is almost more like a puzzle than a boss fight, because he has the strongest Pokemon in the game in terms of raw power, aside from legendaries, but it also has a hindering ability that you can play around. And with Wallace, the Hoenn region has such a wide variety of water types that do vastly different things that you're pretty inevitably going to have to come at him with a combined assault from multiple team members. Aside from Watson, who I'll get to in a minute, he's actually the only one I came close to losing to, because I got tripped up by his Seeking, of all things. Another way several of the gym leaders in this game were made a bit tougher was actually in the way they were paced throughout the adventure, especially around the transfer from early game to mid game, gyms 3 to 5. The Pokemon and moves that would otherwise make these fights very cheesable largely aren't available yet. For Flannery, the Surf HM and most of the region's water and ground types were restricted until after she's defeated. For Norman, the Protect TM is restricted until after he's defeated. meaning in order to cheese him you have to rely on Dig, or on one of the few Pokemon that learns Protect by level up. For Watson, they took this way too far, and partially as a result, his gym battle is quite possibly my least favorite in the entire series, especially if Gen 1 is discounted. He somehow manages to represent the worst of both worlds when it comes to boss fights in this series. On one hand, he can be like Misty in Red, Blue, and Yellow, where his battle isn't really a challenge so much as it's outright unfair. His Magneton is one of the most overpowered Pokemon a boss has ever had for the point in the game where you face them. Its type combination causes it to resist nearly every move learned by every Pokemon available at this point in the adventure. The few water types can hit it for neutral damage, but they take super effective damage from its electric type moves. The few fire and fighting types can hit it for super effective damage, but they still can't outpace its raw power because it's fully evolved. Nearly 10 levels lower than it should be, by the way, while they're still stuck in their far weaker first or second stage. The player is not given access to the Dig TM until after they've defeated him. Plus, this is a battle where the NPC healing items get really egregious. 2 effective full restores this early on is a bit ridiculous. From what I've seen, without either over-leveling or grinding for the Flamethrower TM in this region's awful casino, seriously, in the other regions there's at least a bit of a timing game with the slot machines, in Hoenn it's just pure luck. Out of the 30 plus Pokemon available to the player at this point in the adventure, there are maybe 3 or 4 that can at least semi-reliably 1v1 this Magneton, which is not a good ratio. It's somehow even worse than Brock in Pokemon Yellow. The only way I was able to win with my 2 Pokemon was a really dumb strategy where I just lowered its defense as much as I could with Screech, and hoped they could hit through Paralysis and Confusion enough times before they went down. On the other hand, if you happen to have one of the 2 ground types available before this battle, he turns into a total joke. The worst that any of his Pokemon can do against a ground type is Sonic Boom, so Marshtomp with Mudshot or Geodude with Magnitude can just mindlessly sweep through his team. A battle having an automatic win button dangling off to the side, but being close to impossible otherwise, just isn't very good boss design, in my opinion. On the opposite end of the spectrum to Watson, we have the only gym leaders in this region I consider to be a total joke, Tate and Liza. They were obviously intended to show off double battles as a gimmick, but they only have the 2 Pokemon they lead with, and Solrock and Lunatone just do not have the stats to keep up at this point in the game. Plus, if you happen to have a Dark type on your team, Lunatone can't even hit those. It's way too easy to just bully one side of the field and quickly turn the battle into a 2v1. I really like the Hoenn region, in terms of how distinct it feels from the previous generations in its aesthetic, its aforementioned Pokédex, and its music. In terms of its layout, I'm a little more divided. I actually really disliked playing through the Hoenn games as a kid, almost purely because of how annoying I found certain parts of the region to navigate. It isn't total nonsense like parts of the Kanto region are, and without a doubt the only reason I found Hoenn more confusing was simply because I was more used to Kanto, but I thought it was pretty comparable in how often it left the player to figure out for themselves what they're supposed to do next. Now, I do think a lot of my complaints from back then were just me being dumb. One place I always got lost as a kid was the point in the game where you had to backtrack to Slateport City in order to activate the cutscene where the villains steal the submarine, not realizing there's a pair of grunts you can talk to that pretty much tell you exactly what you're supposed to do. But one thing that I do find a little hard to defend is the water routes. Back when the remakes of the Hoenn games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, came out in 2014, there was a rather infamous IGN review going around where they complained the game had too much water. Everyone clowned on this at the time. It's a tropical island region, of course there's a ton of water. But, to be honest, I get it. You know, maybe that reviewer wouldn't have minded the water if there was actually anything interesting in the water. The last 12 or so routes in this game are just endless blue sheets with little to no variety in terms of which Pokemon you can encounter or what sorts of trainers you can fight, and everything looks the same. Getting back to what I was saying before, after the villains steal the submarine, you're basically tasked with using the Dive HM to look for them. Somewhere, in all this ocean, there's a spot where you can dive and find the villains. And it's not like the underwater areas are a navigable map or dungeon. If you dive in the wrong spot, you have to surface and try again in another random spot in the big blue sheet. Now, if you notice that most of the diveable spots on the surface are the same size and shape as the explorable area below, you can probably deduce that the spot where the villains can be found is one of the few bigger diveable areas, and with that in mind, finding them isn't that bad. Still doesn't make this part of the game fun or interesting, just quicker. Speaking of the villains, Ruby and Sapphire has a mechanic that still today remains unique, aside from their remakes, where the player fights a different villainous group depending on the version. Team Magma if you're playing Ruby, Team Aqua if you're playing Sapphire. The difference is purely aesthetic for the most part. I think it could have been kind of cool if Team Magma largely had fire and rock and ground type teams to represent volcanoes and land, while Team Aqua largely had water and, I don't know, electric or flying types to represent rain and storms, but the only difference to their teams is that a few Team Magma members have Numels and Camerups, which are swapped out for Carvanas and Sharpedos on their Team Aqua equivalents. Even their bosses have identical teams aside from that. I like them a little better than Team Rocket overall, if only because they actually have a defined goal and a plan to achieve it, and there are parts of the story where it feels like what they're doing is having a greater effect on the world. Though I do have to say, in Ruby and Sapphire in particular, the ending of their storyline is really abrupt. You defeat the leader in the seafloor cavern, they try to take control of Groudon or Kyogre, depending on who you're fighting, to turn the tide in their favor, but it all goes wrong, they have a typical what have I done moment. So you go and catch the legendary, a task that, if my previous experiences are anything to go by, is more tedious than difficult. At least now we have timer balls to make it a bit faster, more on those later. And then afterwards, the villains just vanish from the story. No falling action, you never have to interact with them again after this, it just comes to a dead stop immediately after the climax. Steven, a character who was scarcely involved, says a line or two to you, and then fucks off himself. Giovanni in Red, Blue, and Yellow, and the head executive in Gold, Silver, and Crystal at least had brief monologues after you defeat them. And strangely enough, the villains aren't even the only characters in Ruby and Sapphire that this happens with. These are the first games where the player has two rivals, one of them being Brendan or May, the player character you didn't choose, first time they've played a role, actually, and the other being Wally. Thing is, though, rather than the player having more rival encounters to account for the fact that they have more rivals, instead they have the same amount, if not less rival encounters than they normally do, which are then split between these two. Brendan or May appears pretty regularly up to about the transition from mid to late game, but then after your fourth optional battle with them, which can be done before your sixth gym badge if you wish, they just vanish from the story. We never even see their team fully evolved. Wally has pretty much the opposite problem. He appears briefly towards the beginning, but then doesn't show up again at all throughout most of your adventure. By the time he reappears at the end of Victory Road, you likely forgot he even exists because you haven't seen him since before your third gym badge. I certainly did. I don't know why they didn't just combine these two into one character, to be honest. Compared to the villains and the rivals, every human character I do like in Ruby and Sapphire tended to play a much smaller role. Professor Birch doesn't appear in much of the game compared to most of the other Pokemon professors, but the sequence where you have to choose your starter in order to save him from a level 2 Poochyena is pretty funny. This is the only time the player's dad has actually appeared as a character, being one of the gym leaders, and the scene where he grapples with the fact that his own child has surpassed him in skill is pretty nice. And I liked Gabby and Ty just because I could give dumb answers to their Mad Lib-style interviews. This set of games actually has a side quest that has nothing to do with catching legendary Pokemon, the Trick House. It's not much, really, it's just a bunch of extra overworld puzzles for you to solve with a minor reward after each one, but the Trick Master himself is another minor character I like. The most difficult puzzle is probably the trivia. The information needed to answer the questions is all available in the game, but some of them are so ridiculously specific that there is not a single chance anyone would get them right without either going back to specifically check, or just guessing, which is what I did. The main side quest is about catching this game's legendary trio, the Golems, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel. Before you can encounter them, you have to solve what is probably the most cryptic puzzle in the entire series. First, you have to catch a Wailord and a Relicanth, two pretty rare Pokemon. Wailord can be found in the wild by surfing on Route 129, but it only has a 1% encounter rate there. It's probably faster to just fish for a Wailmer that can be evolved in one level. Relicanth can be found underwater at a 5% encounter rate. Then, making sure you have both Pokemon in your party, as well as Pokemon that knows the moves Surf, Dive, and Dig, you must find this remote island on Route 134, a route that's quite difficult to navigate due to water currents affecting where you can go, and surf from one of these two specific tiles, which will then cause the current to pull you to this diveable spot. If you follow the path, you'll eventually see a message on a wall. Click on it, and you can see it's written in visual braille. There's no proper in-game translator. I don't think even the instruction manual has one. So this basically becomes an ARG. When translated, the text says, "Go up here." Surfacing brings you to a room with a bunch of messages written on the wall, which as it turns out is the entire alphabet written in Braille. This could be seen as an in-game translator, but the game doesn't tell you that's what it is, so I imagine most people who've played this game either used a Braille dictionary or just looked it up. At the back of the room is another message, this one telling you to use Dig on that spot, which will open a door taking you to another layer of secret room with one more sign. This one telling you to put the Relicanth you brought along in the first slot of your party and the Wailord in the back. After interacting with the sign with your party set up like this, the game will tell the player it sounds like a door opens somewhere far away, and it does not get any more specific than that. What it actually did was open up 3 caves in pretty obscure locations scattered throughout the Hoenn region, on Route 108, Route 111, and Route 120. To find them, one of the only 3 Ruin Maniac trainers in the whole game is near to each one. And when you go inside, the ARG still isn't over. There's yet another layer of secret room to be opened up. These caves are a lot less difficult to get to than the sealed chamber, so you don't have to be too worried about gathering everything you need before setting out, but the instructions are just as hyper-specific as ever. One of them has you stand in place for 2 minutes, touching no buttons in order to open the door. Finally, once you're inside, you can encounter the golems. I really don't know why they make you go through so much in order to get an encounter with one of these guys compared to any of the other non-roaming legendaries. It's not like they're any stronger than the legendary birds. Anyway, I was fully prepared for the process of catching these 3 to be an absolute slog. I explained this already in my Gold and Silver review, but just to recap, catching legendary Pokemon can often be more of a test of patience than anything else. Usually, it takes a really long time, just for the sake of taking a really long time. Even after being weakened as much as possible, each ball you throw only has a 2 or less % chance of catching them. Gen 3 has the exact same ridiculously low catch rates for legendary Pokemon that Gen 2 had, so for a while I struggled with the Regis. However, I realized Gen 3 actually introduced a new feature that at first I'd forgotten about. Timer Balls. These are, in my opinion, the best Pokeballs in the game, aside from Master Balls. How they work is they become more effective the longer a battle has gone on. You only have to stall for around 10 turns for them to become more effective than an Ultra Ball, and they're actually cheaper as well. Using these, I caught the remaining 2 Regis in a couple of minutes. Nowhere near the grace of Gen 1, but compared to my experience in Gold and Silver, I'll take it. Alright, if my levels look a bit inconsistent for this portion of the video, it's because I am sequence breaking a little bit. I'm covering this now because it can be done during the main adventure. I just personally chose to do this after I was finished with the League in my playthrough because it was a bit easier, and because I was going to be burning up a lot of resources. Ruby and Sapphire added contests, a full-on side mode that has nothing to do with battling or story progression. I didn't plan this, but I'm realizing as I'm writing this script that it's actually quite fitting that I'm playing as May. There are 5 contest categories: Cool, Beauty, Cute, Smart, and Tough, each with 4 ranks: Normal, Super, Hyper, and Master. I decided to focus on beauty contests because I had the perfect Pokemon. Oh, they love it. The first round of every contest is the primary judging. There's no actual gameplay here during the contest itself, the player score depends entirely on prep work done ahead of time. In the Bizarro universe these games are set in, giving Pokemon treats of a certain flavor causes them to exude one of these contest stats, even more if they happen to like the flavor, which depends on their nature, i.e., giving Pokemon Pokeblocks with a dry flavor apparently makes them more beautiful. A Pokemon can also only be given a limited number of Pokeblocks ever, for some reason, so in order to max out their contest stats, you have to make sure you give them high-quality Pokeblocks. These Pokeblocks are made using berries, which are an infinitely renewable resource, but with a pretty massive caveat, as this mechanic was clearly designed for a style of gameplay that is very different from my own. After you plant a berry, it grows in real time, with it taking between 24 and 96 hours before it's harvestable, depending on the rarity of the berry. For someone who progresses the game very slowly, and only plays in shorter daily sessions, that works out fine. For someone like me, who tends to progress through the game very quickly and play in much longer sessions, it means I'll practically be finished with the entire game by the time it takes some of these berries to grow. But without farming them, there are a lot of berries where once they're gone, they're gone. The only way to get more would be creating a new save file, or trading them in from another game. You can probably scramble together enough berries on one save file to max out the contest stats on a couple of Pokemon, especially if you do what I did and wait until the post-game so you can get the best contest berries from this woman in exchange for passwords. I have no idea what the in-game method is supposed to be for obtaining these passwords, by the way, if there even is one. I just looked them up. But if you do care about running out, be cautious. Turning the berries into Pokeblocks entails this QuickTime event minigame that you can do alongside other players or NPCs to get better ones. I'm pretty sure there's a whole complex system where combining different kinds of berries yields vastly different results, but that's really only relevant in multiplayer. In single player, you just have to work with whatever the NPCs use. Once your contest stat is maxed out, the first 3 contest ranks should be an absolute breeze. My Walrein was just so beautiful compared to her opponents that in these first 3 ranks she got enough points in the first round that the second round hardly mattered. Once you get to the Master rank, a maxed out Pokemon's round 1 points will approximately match those of their opponents, so now the player actually has to do well in the Appeal round in order to win. This round has you using moves in order to score points. Every move in the game has a contest type and a contest effect, in addition to its battle type and effect. You can improve your odds by playing methodically during this round, but you're still probably going to have to get a bit lucky in order to win. Sometimes the move used by the person who went before or after you will distract your Pokemon or make them nervous. Sometimes you'll earn like 20 extra points because you were in the right place at the right time, or something, and there's not always much you can do to control it. My strategy was basically just swapping between Surf and Dive, since they were both moves that went over well in beauty contests, and their effects also paired well with one another. The Master rank took 2 attempts, but eventually, we came out on top of the Pokemon contest world. Oh, you can do interviews afterwards? What image do I get when I hear the word beauty? Walrein. Obviously. The story of my Elite Four run in this game is, essentially, the story of a Zangoose, and, to a lesser extent, a Walrein, carrying a bunch of slackers. Compared to several of the gym leaders, the Elite Four of the Hoenn region, especially the first 2, I actually had quite an easy time with. You might be wondering why Zangoose, of all Pokemon, is so good here. I think a lot of the people who play Pokemon severely underestimate just how broken setup moves are in single player, especially the ones that boost attack and special attack. A Pokemon has to be like far-fetched level weak to not become busted as a result of learning these. There is a reason why a lot of difficulty ROM hacks basically remove player access to them. Setting up Swords Dance, Zangoose could pretty much sweep all of the first 3 fights. Against Sydney, I just needed to get my Yina out of the way to avoid getting annoyed by Sand Attack, so she could easily set up on whatever came out next, so long as it wasn't Absol. Aw, you bitch. God damn, dude. Against Phoebe, her Dusclops could Dieter set up with Confuse Ray, but it almost never went for it, and even if it did, Persian Berries exist. Glacia's lead has no status moves. As for Drake, Honestly, Zangoose probably could sweep his team as well, but I think Walrein was a better choice for that fight, since she can one-shot his whole team without setup. The only reason I ever lost against any of them was because, on my second attempt at the Pokemon League, Glacia got a really lucky first turn freeze, and she later landed a first turn sheer cold in the same fight. Like, I had to get pretty turbo unlucky to not win here. The only battle in this Pokemon League that actually took more of a team effort was the champion, Steven. I think this is a really cool fight. Compared to the last theme champion, Steven's team manages to have an obvious theme, minerals, while still being quite varied. Unlike Lance, there is no single type that all, or even the majority of his team is weak to. Even water only hits 3 of them for super effective damage. That being said, I enjoyed myself throughout this whole playthrough, but right at the end, the game found a way to make me lose my patience with it. My luck against Steven was abysmal. On my first attempt at the Pokemon League, I had him. My Walrein outspeeds his Armaldo, she does more than half of Armaldo's health, Walrein just has to take this hit and we've won. And what happens? He crits. And gets an Omni Boost. Which actually might have mattered, because I did still have one more Pokemon in the back, and my Sceptile was able to get off a Leaf Blade, but possibly because of the Omni Boost, Armaldo survives still, and finishes off my team. My second loss to Steven, admittedly, was more my fault. I'd been leading with my Torkoal to take on his Skarmory, which would then consistently bait out his Metagross, who would then want to use Earthquake, allowing me to get a free switch into my Flygon. The problem I was having is that, unless I hit very specific damage ranges, Flygon couldn't get a clean 2-shot on his Metagross due to its Citrus Berry. On this attempt, I tried seeing if Torkoal could take an Earthquake and do a bit of extra damage so Flygon could get the 2-shot, but she couldn't, and I wasn't really able to recover from there. On my third attempt against Steven, my 4th overall attempt at the Pokemon League, things start out seemingly normal. Skarmory lands a crit on Torkoal, but still comes nowhere close to winning the 1v1. Metagross comes out, I take my free switch into Flygon. He may not be able to consistently 1v1 Metagross, but maybe he can at least get them into a position where someone else on my team can finish them off. Except this time Metagross goes for Psychic instead of Earthquake. What? It's because Skarmory landed that crit, which put Torkoal into a health range where either Psychic or Earthquake could KO, causing Metagross to choose between them randomly. The luck that I have been having in this fight. I pretty much assume that this attempt is lost already. I just start throwing out Pokemon randomly, believing they're all just going to fall to Metagross one by one. It almost looks like I might get some luck in my favor when he uses Hyper Beam to take out my Sceptile, giving my Torkoal a chance to attack, but it just barely misses the KO. Steven full restores, and Torkoal goes down with Metagross at almost the exact same health they were at originally. Zangoose is next. She outspeeds and sets up with Swords Dance, but it's seemingly in vain because Steven hits with Hyper Beam and Zangoose survives. Okay, I certainly wasn't expecting that. Zangoose isn't exactly known for being bulky, but I'll take a bit of luck in my favor for a change. The recharge turn allows her to set up another Swords Dance, and she proceeds to not only finish off Metagross, but sweep through 4 more of Steven's Pokemon, only just barely missing the KO on his Armaldo. From there, it's just a matter of Walrein outspeeding and finishing off the bug with Surf. You know, once Steven runs out of full restores. And with that, Zangoose, her sidekick Walrein, and the rest of the team, who all probably have a pretty serious inferiority complex now, are inducted into the Hall of Fame, and the main adventure of Pokémon Ruby is complete. Compared to Gold, Silver, and Crystal, the post-game of Ruby and Sapphire is a lot more Gen 1-esque. There's one more round with the Trickmaster, there's a gift Beldum you can pick up in Steven's house, there's an additional field encounter legendary that I think would be better leaving until the next Hoenn adventure. There's also a roaming legendary that I didn't bother looking for at all. Outside of this game's battle facility, that's about it. The Battle Tower makes a return in this game, and it's a mostly refined version of the one from Pokémon Crystal. It still doesn't have the battle point reward system that most of the later battle facilities use, and you'd think, even though they barely put double battles in the main adventure of these games, they'd at least be available here, but nope. However, it has hundreds of potential opposing Pokemon instead of 16 per level group. And it has streaks, which causes each consecutive round you win to not only become more difficult, but also give better prizes. Plus, it's far more accessible. And yet, at the same time it isn't. Let me explain what I mean. What made the Battle Tower in Crystal so tough for the average player to partake in was that every one of the opposing Pokemon you faced had maxed out stat experience. Maxing out stat experience required KOing upper hundreds to thousands of opposing Pokemon, and there was no thought to be put into which stats are focused on. Ideally, you would just put 65,000 stat experience into all 6 stats. In Gen 3, stat experience was replaced with effort values, or EVs, which are not only more convenient, but also a lot more sophisticated in my opinion. Opposing Pokemon will give either 1, 2, or 3, usually depending on their stat total and what stage of evolution they're in, and which EV they give out normally depends on what their highest stat is. On some species, it's split. A Pokemon can gain up to 252 EVs in each stat, and 510 total, meaning instead of maxing out every stat, you have to choose 2 that would be best to focus on. Or turn it into a jack-of-all-trades, master of none, but the former is usually the better option. Even doing it as slowly and inefficiently as possible, maxing out a Pokemon's EVs is far faster than maxing out stat experience ever was, and the Winstraight family also gives you an item called the Macho Brace, which halves the amount of time you have to spend. For most of the EVs, there are convenient training spots around the Hoenn region. Every encounter in Rusturf Tunnel and Route 118 respectively gives out HP and Speed EVs. Route 112 has a 75% Newble encounter for special attack EVs. The only stat that I had a bit of an annoying time with was attack, where the best I could do was the 29% chance of encountering either a Nuzleaf or a Zangoose on Route 114. Unfortunately, in this game there's no way of removing unwanted EVs your Pokemon accumulated during the main adventure, but their stat distribution doesn't have to be that streamlined to partake in the Battle Tower. You could probably train a team of 3 in a couple of hours at most. Now to get to what I meant when I said this Battle Tower was somehow less accessible at the same time. In Pokemon Crystal, there were a bunch of different level groups ranging from 10 to 100. In Ruby and Sapphire, there are only 2, 50 and 100. And I guess this is before they had the technology that allowed them to temporarily level down a Pokemon when challenging a battle facility, so in order to enter, a Pokemon has to be organically at that level or below. This means that if your Pokemon went past level 50 during the main adventure, you either have to train an entirely new team, or get them all the way to level 100. So, how did I enter the level 50 group with a trio of Pokemon that you've probably seen in the footage were already above the level cap? Don't worry about it. The first few rounds of the Battle Tower are very easy. At this point, many of the Pokemon used by the opponents aren't even fully evolved. It's mainly when your win streak starts to approach 42 that things really begin to ramp up, as by then the opponents will start using legendaries. After some refining, my strategy basically wound up being spam Earthquake with Flygon. If that didn't work, try and set up a sweep with Zangoose Swords Dance. If all else fails, have Walrein sit there, absorb hits, and try to stall everything to death. Unlike many later battle facilities, there's no specific number of fights you want to win in order to beat the facility. Once you get to 42 consecutive wins, the prize for winning a round will change from a random vitamin to a random held item, so you could get something cool like a choice band, but if your luck is anything like mine, it'll probably just be some useless shit like a mental herb. And you can get some ribbons or trophies for achieving certain streaks, but these are just aesthetic. Aside from that, it's purely a high score sort of thing. Mine ended up being 52. You really have to be prepared for anything, because doing that many battles with that wide a variety of potential opponents, you can lose to some dumb shit in here. One of my streaks ended because I ran into a Ludicolo that completely stalled me out of attacks with Double Team and Leftovers. Even when it got to that point, it still took forever for the battle to end because both Pokemon were dealing back nearly as much damage as they were taking from Struggle and Recoil. It was partially a misplay on my part. I really shouldn't have been using a move that could paralyze them, because then maybe I could have poisoned them with Walrein before she ran out of moves. I should have just reset, but I was holding on to a vain hope that maybe I'd get really lucky with crits and full paralysis or something, but no such thing happened. Ruby and Sapphire are, without a doubt, the best games I've played so far in this series. We were getting there in Gen 2, and to some extent we're still getting there now, but I'm starting to truly be reminded why I even started this series. These are probably the first ones I've covered that I would actually choose to play casually. Obviously there are still some issues, which I covered, but none of them are major deal-breaking flaws to me. This is just a well-paced, well-balanced, mechanically sound set of games. Again, I do think there is a version of the Hoenn games that is probably just objectively better in most ways, which I hope to get to in the somewhat near future, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Not counting upper versions, Gen 3 was the first generation to include multiple sets of games, so we have a lot more to get to first.